Mites are another group of arthropods that can be feeding on the surface of plants and cause injuries. And let's talk about this a little bit. Because there's two main groups that you might see on an outdoor plant. There are what we call spider mites, by far the more important of the two in terms of causing plant injury. And then there are the rust mites. Now let's get into the rust mites because they're not talked about a whole lot. What is a rust mite? Well, it's in the family of mites known as the Eriophyid mites. Eriophyidae, most of the ones we're talking about would be in that family. There are two other smaller families that are closely related. And when we talk about Eriophyid mites, often the discussion is about their ability to produce galls. A great many of them produce galls on plants, different kinds of little balls or finger galls, or an aurenium, a kind of a felty little overgrowth of the plant hairs on plants. Anyway, that's a separate discussion, gall making insects and mites. There are some that don't make galls, and these we'd call a rust mite or sometimes a russet mite. And these are ones that do not create a gall. They instead live on the surface. It's a term maybe unfair. They're called leaf vagrants because they don't have a gall within which to live, but they live on the leaf surface. Now, these are minute mites. I haven't emphasized this yet, I don't think enough, but these are very tiny. You can see large numbers on that picture of cypress in the right, but most often they are not going to be visible to the unaided eye. I mean, they literally would make a spider mite look like an elephant by comparison. So typically to see these, you are going to need some sort of magnification. And they're often hidden in little cracks in the leaf surface or little areas that make them even more difficult to see. Now, they are extremely tiny, and of course their mouth parts are tiny. This is an electron micrograph of a Eriophyid mite head with the mouth part. It's just a tiny little peg, and the only cells it can reach are the surface cells, the epidermal cells. These cannot reach deeply at all into the plant. So the injuries we're going to see associated with them are going to be epidermal cell injuries. And these cells will often be destroyed with a feeding puncture. Ultimately, the epidermal cells die, and if you have a lot of these being injured, then the surface will get a russeting, a browning. Now, in the picture on the left, we're seeing it occurring on fruit. So there are russet mites that damage fruit, and you get kind of a bronzing effect on the fruit. That's a defect. It can also occur on plants, and since many people taking this course seem to want to talk about hemp and cannabis, there is a russet mite on hemp. It causes kind of an off color, but leaves become a little bit smaller. Mostly they also affect the developing flower buds too, which is a little more difficult to show. But we're talking about ornamental plants here, and so rust mites do occur on several kinds of ornamental plants, not as often as we see spider mites, but the one around here that I see very commonly would be honey locust. Honey locust has a spider mite, as we'll talk about in a second, but it also has a rust mite, and the rust mite trees that have the rust mites tend to look a little more browner, and ones that have the spider mites tend to be a little more yellower. Yeah, but you can have both of them on the same plant. Privet has a mite that's fairly common that causes a kind of off color to that plant, more commonly in the Midwest than we'd see around here. Cypress, hemlock, our plants also will have the rust mites on in some parts of the country. So a rust mite is a very tiny mite that lives on the surface. It's in the Eriophyid mite family, but is not one of the Eriophyid mites that make a gall. Spider mites are far more important as a family of mites in terms of injuring plants. And they're bigger, tiny, but bigger than an Eriophyid mite, much bigger. They feed in a slightly different way. They have mouth parts known as chelicerae. They all call it chelicerae, but they're in different functions and forms. And in the way that spider mites will feed is the chelicerae kind of beat the cells. They break the cells. So they're not puncturing into the cells with stylets, they're whipping the cells. And this destroys the cells and releases the cell contents. So what you see when an area, a spider mite has been feeding is an area that is a white fleck. And that white fleck we call a stippling injury. That white fleck results from cells that have been destroyed, the contents evacuated, and then of course they're empty, so they become white. And each feeding site where spider mite might feed might kill a dozen cells, maybe 2 dozen cells, and the cells damaged reach into the mesophyll. So it's not just epidermis, it's mesophyll as well. Little white spot, cells are empty of chlorophyll, and we call this a stippling injury. In high populations, spider mites will cause a generalized discoloration. And in some plants, it may be kind of a yellowing or look white and bleached, as it is in these images. It may be a duller color. Evergreens, it tends to be a little duller because of the waxes kind of covering up the injury to a little bit. In that case, or it could be a color change, a bronzing, and in some cases even a reddening of leaves is the response. But in all of these pictures I've just shown, there has been quite extensive damage by spider mites, and with it you will see a lot of reduction in plant photosynthesis because there has been a lot of cells that have been damaged, epidermal and mesophyll cells. Webbing may be visible, often is not, but many spider mites will produce some webbing in high populations, and if you do see high populations and webbing, you're in trouble. This webbing can cover the plant and protect the spider mites. If there's dust incorporated into it as well, they will be further protected. And these little threads, these strands that they use to cover the plant, even if it's not in the form of an intact sheet, just little strands, these are little highways that they use to walk around the plant. So I think maybe you can see in the picture now that I've made it move, little mites that are just walking on these threads. You can't see the threads themselves, but that's what they're traveling on. So they use that to walk around on the plant. Now, the life history of spider mites is much simpler and much more normal than that of an aphid. So there will always be sexual reproduction with mites, and an egg will be produced, and then you'll have younger stages that molt and get bigger, molt and get bigger. The only strange thing about the development of most spider mites is that the first stage out of the egg, very, very tiny, the larva, we call it, has only 6 legs, and then in the next molt it will have 8 legs, 4 pair, the normal number that we'd expect with an arachnid. They have males, they have females, about the same size. Males are a little smaller, often have a little pointy butt, and they mate, and the females will lay eggs. And here's a female with the eggs here on the left, a comparative male. Nice pictures from David Shetler here. And the eggs that are produced are, I think, remarkably large in proportion to the body of the animal that produces it. So I think the picture on the left shows this the best. There are 3 mature female spider mites in this image, and all around them you can see these large round objects. Those are spider mite eggs, and a female may be producing 4, 5, 6 of these a day, and then when the eggs hatch, these shells remain behind. So spider mites do produce large eggs, and these eggs do produce a good diagnostic. So they will produce eggs, you can see. They will also cast their skins, as do all insects, but leave their skins behind because they can't chew them. So you'll see both the cast skins and the eggs on a plant that has had or does have spider mites on it. Again, a high population of honeylocust spider mite in this image right here, the things that are generally white in this image, those are old cast skins, but again, the little balls, those are eggs, kind of randomly distributed all over this leaf surface. Once the egg hatches, you have the immature form, the larva emerging from that, and then it progresses ultimately adult. As all insects and mites are cold-blooded, the rate of development will be in relation to temperature, and some information here on two-spotted spider mite, indicating that a generation, that from the time an egg is deposited until an adult form is produced, would take about 2.5 weeks at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but it can be completed within a week at 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So not surprising here, but a little information in terms of the specifics on how temperature can affect a common spider mite, the two-spotted spider mite. How do mites get around? Well, they can walk. I showed an image of them walking around on the threads, and they're walking around on the plants. For long distance, spider mites can disperse by ballooning. Aerified mites for that matter too. But in the case of spider mites, they can produce a bit of silk in addition to just being blown by the wind. And they will often go to the tip of a plant and maybe splay out a little silk thread, carry it, help carry the mite into the air and be deposited, hopefully for the mite, someplace where it can then find a new host. How do they get through winter? Well, a couple different ways, but the most common way is that they will go into a dormant state. They'll go into diapause, that state of arrested development where they have largely shut down their metabolism. They're no longer reproducing, and many times with spider mites, they may also change their color as they go into diapause. And once in diapause, they may be able to survive without feeding for months. So this will typically be triggered by day length, or maybe day length plus some cold weather. And they will be sustained in diapause until there is another environmental set of events that causes them to break out and resume activity. So, example in this image right here. In the upper left, we have a male and female honey locust spider mite out for a walk in the summer. So, but in the wintertime, the male is dead. They don't survive winter, but the females will go into diapause. And in this case, this honey locust spider mite, they turn orange, and you would find them tucked around buds, as illustrated in the picture on the lower right, or maybe in cracks and crevices on the trunk of the tree with this species. Others may be in diapause under leaf litter, under other protected sites off the plant. But again, they will remain in diapause until environment, day length, sufficient cold period has passed, allow them to resume activity. Some will spend the winter as eggs, and all the ones I've seen, the eggs will be reddish, and they would be laid on surface of the plant. So these would be spider mite eggs here. An unusual thing that see with spider mites every once in a while up in the high country in Colorado is an image such as this. People will notice this kind of reddish crust on the bark, or it could sometimes be on one of them was on a tombstone, but and could be the side of a building. But the reddish crust, when you look closely, those are eggs. Those are eggs, in this case, of a mite called the brown mite, a mite that we would also encounter in certain fruit tree systems in North America. Now, there are lots of mites, lots of spider mites, but most of the problems on trees and shrubs involve a handful of species. So the big three that I would deal with where I live would be two-spotted spider mite as the first one. This is the single most important spider mite. Usually when people say they have a spider mite problem, it is specifically the two-spotted spider mite. It has a huge host range, and it is the one we would have on our house plants normally. It's the one we would have on our roses, on our beans, many kinds of outdoor flowers. It is the most common aphid on cannabis, spider mite on cannabis crops. It is also in this state found in western Colorado on pears and eastern Colorado on field corn. Anyway, point made, this one feeds on a lot of different kinds of plants. Honey locust is got a specific mite that just feeds on honey locust. And honey locust spider mite is one that I will often see causing damage to honey locusts that are grown as a street tree. I have never seen it except once in Texas, where it was much hotter and drier, where it was on a honey locust tree that was in a yard or in a park. And I'm going to get to that because this gets into why mites can be a problem in some sites rather than others. Then there are conifer feeding spider mites, and there are many of these. Yeah, some of them might be on a pine, some of them might be on on taxus or yew, some of them might be on spruce, and some of them might be on multiple kinds of plants. But there are several conifer feeding mites, and I'm not going to go into the individual ones. They may produce webbing. One of the most common and important of the spider mites on conifers is spruce spider mite, and you can see some webbing in this image. But you have to have quite high populations if that is to occur. One of the things that I think, though, that is important to keep in mind with the ones on conifers is they tend to all be cool season mites, and that is a term meaning that their activity periods are in the cooler periods of the year. So around here they would be active in fall and they would be active in spring. It would probably be too cold in the deep of winter, but it gets too hot in summer. They go dormant. They go into diapause. These go into diapause when it gets too hot. So when we look at the ones on conifers, we might want to be looking at them in April. Symptoms may not show up until July when there's heat stress, but the mites are doing most of the damage in spring. And again, the timing will shift depending on where you're living, but you look for these ones in the cool season. So spider mite management will be the subject of the next subject, and I think that just about